Hello, I'm the author of Daniel11truth.com, Watching God Work. The purpose of this video is to give a general understanding of biblical end times from start to finish. I mean, where does a person even start to look for end times in the Bible? Where does a person begin? The Bible can be somewhat overwhelming, and if you rely on the internet or even preachers, there's a stark difference of opinion. So how does a person know which opinion is correct, since only one can be? I mean, there are pre-tribs, post-tribs, and even some mid-tribs in the middle, but why do they disagree? If all are saying that they're going by the Bible, actually, they all have contradictions with the Bible. They disagree because God chose to leave some things hidden until the end, and now they have been revealed. My interpretation is unique because it has no contradictions. One big difference is that I explain biblically that seals 1 through 5 are in the past. But that's on a different video called The Seven Seals. I also interpret Daniel 11 differently and show that the abomination in verse 31 is the next verse to happen. That's important because that's the event that Jesus emphasized in Matthew 24:15 when he tells Judea to flee to the mountains. Yet Daniel 11 is also on a different video. This video is to explain how a person can go about verifying the basic timeline of end times to know which theory is correct, pre-trib, post-trib, or mid-trib. So how do I know if I'm correct? Well, I'll guide you through the scriptures and show you exactly why there's only one possible way that could be correct if you consider everything and don't pick and choose. Many people have asked about my background and credentials. Well, I go by the Bible. That's my credentials. But I was raised in the Assemblies of God, which is a worldwide denomination. However, I don't agree with their timeline of Revelation either because it has contradictions, like all the others. When I was called to study end times, I started with just the Bible. But I suggest to others that they can follow this video so you don't reinvent the wheel. In this video, I'll explain my method and process that I went through. Number one, you have to start with what you know is correct and don't force things to match preconceived notions. Start with a clean slate. Use common sense. Don't force things to match preconceived notions. Don't rely on a single common word or phrase and twist everything else to match. You'd be surprised how many people do that. But if you're twisting everything to match, you're just deceiving yourself and others. Let Scripture verify Scripture. Don't force things to match preconceived notions. As you can tell, that's my central theme, is to start with a clean slate. Don't start with preconceived notions where you have to twist everything. I didn't have any preconceived notions. What I did was separate the facts from rumors and opinion. And by facts, I mean Scripture that I could verify with other Scriptures, or things that had to match each other, such as the abomination that causes desolation in the book of Daniel, because that's what Jesus said to start with. In Matthew 24:15, he makes clear that the abomination is vitally important. Yet most people ignore the book of Daniel when they're talking about end times. Personally, I started studying Daniel 11 in 1996 when I first started studying end times. But I didn't solve all the historical verses until 2009. That's a long time. But I didn't study the whole time. Around 1999 or 2000, I actually gave up because I wasn't making any progress. And because the internet was pretty primitive back in the late 90s, we had dial-up modems and they were very slow, and some pages that were so advanced that the computer wouldn't even pull it up. It would just freeze and you'd have to restart the computer. But in 2009, I was inspired to restart my search, and the internet was much more advanced then. You could go from encyclopedia to encyclopedia and page after page of history, and finally I pieced all the historical verses together to solve Daniel 11. But it was only because that was the timing that God had chosen that he wanted me to solve it. So at that time in 2009, we were only on verse 22. But now we've completed verse 30. And of course, the abomination is verse 31. It's the next thing to happen. But see, in the last 8 years, we've completed about 8 or 9 verses. So things are really picking up, as you would expect for something, a chapter like Daniel 11 that was sealed until the time of the end. It's getting more rapid as we get toward the end. But regarding end times, I treated questions like variables in an algebraic system of equations, kind of like in high school, you had 3 equations and 3 unknowns, and all the x's had to be equal to one another, and all the y's had to be equal to another. And that's kind of like Bible. You know, if you had a variable that was in Matthew and Daniel both, then they both had to make sense together. Plus, the abomination was in 4 different chapters of Daniel, so they all had to make sense together in the same timeline, or else it was no good. So that's pretty much where I started, was with the abomination in Matthew and Daniel. But Revelation also had to match. Another variable that was very unique was Gog and Magog. So the battle with Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 had to be the same battle with Gog and Magog in Revelation 20, because that's not just a common word or phrase, that's a unique word or phrase. So like Gog and Magog and abomination that causes desolation, that was 2 things that I knew had to match up in every book. So that's a good place to start. And then everything else kind of fell into place, like systems of equations. And my conclusion after I was all done was that pre-tribulation was indeed correct, but not the way that churches currently teach Matthew 24 and Revelation. In my opinion, they overlook a lot of the obvious. And the obvious is what I mean is the rapture, which in Matthew 24, 29 to 31. This is obviously the rapture. Immediately after the distress in those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars from the sky will fall, and heavenly bodies will be shaken. That's the signs in the sun, moon, and stars. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but it says, at that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. That's obviously the rapture, because they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, and he's gathering the elect. That's what rapture means, to gather in the sky. And the loud trumpet call matches the description of the rapture that Paul gives in Thessalonians, according to the Lord's own word. He's like, this ain't my opinion. This is the Lord's own word. We tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. That means died. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And we will be with the Lord forever. That's obviously the rapture. And the trumpet call of God is matching the same loud trumpet call in Matthew 24, 29 through 31. And being caught up together with the Lord in the air, in the clouds, is the same thing as gathering the elect in the clouds of the sky. So this is obviously the rapture. And Paul gives one more description. Listen, I'll tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will be changed in the flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So the trumpet will sound is the same trumpet call of God, when we will be changed at the last trumpet. But it's in the King James Version, this is interpreted the last trump, meaning the last verse. The last note. Because the twinkling of an eye is like a split second. And the trumpet call of God is going to be more than a split second. It's going to be like a series of notes. So it'll be at the very last note that we're changed in the twinkling of an eye and meet Jesus in the air. But my point is the Matthew 24, 29 through 31 at the signs in the sun, moon, and stars is definitely the rapture. There's no question about it. And to find a timing for that rapture, you have to go to the book of Revelation. Because Revelation is a more detailed account of end times. When Jesus was describing the end times to his disciples in Matthew 24, he was, it was a general description. It was fairly detailed, but not as detailed as Revelation. So you would naturally want to use the most detailed description of end times to look at the less detailed, not the other way around. But he says, I watched as the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, period. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and stars in the sky fell to earth like late figs dropping from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. That's the same signs in the sun, moon, and stars as in verse 29. There's no question about it. These are both talking about end times, and there wouldn't be two occasions in end times for the sun, moon, and stars to be so similar and it be two different events. That's just a silly thing to say. Some people do say that, but it's just silly. These are obviously the same event. So the sixth seal is definitely the rapture because of the signs in the sun, moon, and stars. And also, there's other support. It says the sky receded like a scroll rolling up. Well, that's the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the sky before they see the Son of Man. The scroll rolling up. And then the kings of the earth, the princes, general, the rich, mighty, slave, every free man hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. See, they knew it was Jesus, the Lamb. And the nations of the earth will mourn. Well, that was them mourning if they were calling for the mountains and rocks to fall on them. They were in mourning because they knew Jesus was appearing in the sky with great glory, and they were messing up because they failed to believe that Jesus was their Messiah. And so, they messed up. They were in mourning. But this is obviously the sixth seal is the rapture in Revelation. So, from there, from the sixth seal, it produces two groups in Revelation 7. One group is the Israelites who are sealed by God but remain on earth. And the other group is the Christians who are in heaven in front of the Lamb. Starting in verse 2, then I saw another angel coming up from the east having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea, do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Then I heard their number that were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. And then it lists out 12,000 from each tribe. So you know that this 144,000 are from the tribes of Israel. They're Jews. Now people have asked me that, said, well, can it be more than 144,000? Well, sure, that's up to God. This is, it could be a symbolic number, but there's no doubt that it's from the tribes of Israel. It wouldn't be more like Gentiles sneaking in because, it strictly describes the tribes of Israel one by one. And other people have asked me, well, do they have to be living in Israel? What if a Jew is living in Europe or America? Could they be included? Well, sure. The 144,000 would be the most devout Jews that God is selecting as his select. But if there are some devout Jews living in Europe or America or wherever, they possibly could be included in the 144,000. They don't necessarily have to be living in Jerusalem. They just have to be of the tribes of Israel. But, that's the Jews. That's one group. And then the other group is the Christians. After that, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every tribe, nation, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. The palm branches signify arrival, like when everyone waved palm branches when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem for the last time. That's what we'll be doing in heaven for just a brief period of time. We'll be holding palm branches when we first arrive, and then we'll proceed to the wedding supper of the Lamb and go to the banquet. But this is the Christians. The great multitude that no one could count is obviously a different group from the ones that were, these could obviously be counted. Whether it's an exact 144,000 is irrelevant, but these have a definite count, and this is a great multitude that no one could count. And it's from every nation and tribe, and this is just from the tribes of Israel. So it's obviously, these are two different groups. And these are in heaven before the throne, and these remain on earth, because the 144,000 are also mentioned later on in Revelation, so you know they remain on earth. So it's important to know that there's two different groups produced after the sixth seal rapture in Revelation. That's important. And then moving on from this second group, it says, then one of the elders asked me, these in white robes, who are they and where did they come from? I answered, Sir, you know. And he said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. But notice that is past tense. They have come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes, not will wash. So that's saying that the great tribulation has already passed. And it mentions it in Revelation 7, but what it's referring to is the seals in Revelation 6, because it's in the past. Because the great tribulation is the seals, of which seal number 1 was the resurrection, and seal number 6 is the rapture. That's explained in the other video when I explained the seals historically and biblically, but that's what they were. You can't wash your robe in the blood of the Lamb until Jesus was crucified and resurrected. He had to shed his blood to defeat Satan, and then we could wash our robes in his blood and be saved. And then the rapture is when the trumpet call of God sounds in seal 6, and the multitude is taken to heaven. So it's from the resurrection to the rapture when people can wash their robes in the blood of the Lamb. So the great tribulation refers to the seals. That's not to be confused with what people say the tribulation is. They just don't understand the seals, but the regular tribulation is actually the trumpets and the bowls, which happen in Revelation 8 forward. So that's different from the great tribulation. But people just don't understand the seals. That's the one difference in the way that I describe end times in Revelation. Revelation 8 is where the seventh seal is. It says there were silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. Then the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to sound them, meaning they haven't sounded them yet. It had to be after the silence, because naturally you can't sound a trumpet during a silence. That would be crazy. So they start to sound them afterward. And then the trumpet call of God is before the silence, because naturally the sixth seal is in Revelation 6 and the seventh seal is in Revelation 8, and you have the trumpet call of God before the silence, before the seventh seal. And then also the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned to blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died. So the reason I point that out is that that's the exact same things that they stopped the angels from harming before the 144,000 were sealed. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on their forehead. And see, and that's exactly the same thing that the first two trumpets are harming: the land, the sea, and the trees. So he's basically saying, hey, wait, don't start the trumpet plagues until I seal the 144,000. That's exactly what it's saying. And so that's saying, it's pointing out that the Christians arrive in heaven at the same time the 144,000 are being sealed, and both of those happen before the trumpet plagues. So just a brief summary: the sixth seal has to be the rapture, because it's the same signs in the sun, moon, and stars. And seals 1 through 5 are in the past, explained in the other video, but seal 6 is next. The rapture is next, which is pre-tribulation. And then you have the multitude of Christians in heaven in Revelation 7, and the 140,000 Israelites still on earth. But that's the two groups in Revelation 7. And you have the silence as the seventh seal in Revelation 8 before the trumpet plays can begin. All that's very important because it proves pre-tribulation, because the Christians are in heaven between the sixth seal and the seventh seal. Because you got to go from Revelation 6, 7 to 8 in succession. That's just common sense. But common sense proves pre-tribulation. Warning, all post-tribs overlap the seals, trumpets, and bowls, which they should not do because it inevitably leaves some things out due to contradictions, which is forbidden by God. It's forbidden in Revelation 22:19 because it says, if anyone takes words away from this book of prophecy, God will take away from him his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. Meaning he's taken away heaven because that's where the tree of life and holy city are. Because they're taking away words out of Revelation, which is God's prophecy. So basically, overlapping the seals, trumpets, and bowls is essentially taking away 2/3 of Revelation. Because the post-tribs can't explain post-tribulation without stacking everything on top of one another and overlapping these. But when you overlap things, it inevitably leaves things out because, see, there's a lot of things happening during the trumpets, such as the two witnesses prophesying and the Antichrist rising up during the trumpets. And when you stack them all on top of one another, what they're doing is they take the Antichrist and throw it before the rapture so that everybody is looking for the wrong thing. You know, they just rearrange God's prophecy, and they shouldn't be doing that. It's just common sense. And because when they change God's prophecy of end times, that makes them false prophets by definition. I mean, I'm not just trying to criticize them. False prophets change God's prophecy just by definition, and that's what they're doing when they stack everything on top of one another. But they don't tell you they're doing that. Jesus said, leave them. They are blind guides. If a blind man leads a blind man, both will fall into a pit. See, that's an important verse because that throws some of the responsibility on those following the false prophets as well as the false prophets. So it's both responsibility. You got to call them like you see them and say, ask questions. Well, what happened to the trumpets and bowls? Because they kind of ignore all that. And they just kind of focus on one thing and just leave a lot of things out. But see, people can't take words away from Revelation. But that's what they do. So don't believe false prophets. Don't believe post-tribs, because that's what they are. This, going back to Matthew 24, I'll explain a little more about the post-tribs. And remember, there's two groups in Revelation 7. So that has to be the same two groups in Revelation 24, 15 through 31. One group was the Christians in heaven. This is the same one, Matthew 24, that we established that this is the rapture when they gather the elect from the four winds, when they have the signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and then the rapture. So to get the timing of this rapture, you have to look at Revelation. And like I say, there's two groups in Revelation 7, the same as the two groups in Matthew 24. What the post-tribs want to do is just treat this all as one group and make all these sequential. But see, they can't do that. They're ignoring part of Revelation when they do that. They're ignoring the two groups and just making everything one group. But see, you can't do that. That's what I was talking about in preconceived notions. They preconceive that this is all sequential, and then they twist Revelation around to make it fit. But you shouldn't be doing that because Revelation, like I said, is the most detailed series of events of end times. And you wouldn't take the most detailed series of events and squeeze them together to fit the less detailed. That's the wrong way to do. So, but that's That's what they do. And you can tell this is the other group. It says, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. What that means is the 144,000 in Revelation 7 are mentioned again in 14 and 15 when they're martyred. They're martyred in 14 and 15 so they don't have to go through the bowl plagues, which the bowl plagues are much more severe than the trumpet plagues. See, if their days had not been cut short, they would not survive. See, they wouldn't have survived the bowl plagues. But it says, for false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I've told you ahead of time. See, it's not possible because, see, they're told ahead of time. They receive that seal on their forehead symbolically so that they know and they won't be deceived. When the false prophet comes and performs great signs and miracles, and he enacts the mark of the beast in Revelation 13, so they're not deceived, and then they're martyred in 14 and 15 afterward. And see, they don't take the mark of the beast. So this is talking about the 144,000 Israelites. And then this little section down here is just kind of a transition when he's transitioning from the Jews back to the Gentiles. It says, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. That's kind of applying to both groups, Christians and Jews, but he's kind of transitioning back to the Christians. But the main thing to remember is that there are two groups, not just one group, two groups, because it has to match Revelation 7. And the post-dribs just try to ignore all that. But the other thing I was going to say was that immediately after the distress in these days, that's the distress caused by the abomination that causes desolation. Because says, that's when the Judea flees to the mountains. They're not supposed to take anything out of the house. I mean, it's an emergency. They have to go right then. It says, for then there will be a great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. That's because of the sixth seal, the great earthquake. Remember? And that great earthquake will produce a tsunami that starts to head toward Israel, and that's why Judea has to flee to the mountains. Because that's what you naturally do. When a tsunami is coming, you flee to higher ground. So the distress is caused by the earthquake of the sixth seal, and then the sixth seal describes the sun, moon, and stars, just like these Christians in heaven, and the rapture describes the same thing. Immediately after the distress in those days, it's basically saying immediately after the earthquake. It's just not saying it like that, but that's exactly what it means, because the sixth seal, there was an earthquake, and then the sun, moon, and stars, and this is immediately after the earthquake, then the sun, moon, and stars. And the distress is caused by the earthquake because it produces a tsunami. So everything makes sense. And this is the rapture. And it happens right after the abomination that causes desolation. And that's why Jesus conveyed such an urgency. It'll happen right after. So, some facts that you need to know is that the abomination, which Jesus mentioned from the book of Daniel, happens immediately before the rapture. Yet, don't try to wait until you actually see it before accepting Jesus, because the news of the earthquake can't possibly travel fast enough for people in the West before the rapture happens. What I mean by that is there's another Old Testament scripture that says that God will darken the rising sun. So that kind of narrows it down from sunrise to noon, but that's talking about Israel. And sunrise to noon in Israel, because of the time difference, is like the middle of the night over in the West, in Europe and America, where a bulk of the Christians are. They'll be asleep. But even if they were awake watching the news in the middle of the night and saw that an earthquake happened and a tsunami was heading toward Israel, still, they just, you just wouldn't get the news quick enough where you could be saved. And so I'm just saying that you need to be saved ahead of time. Don't wait for the abomination. be prepared, because Gentiles only get one chance at the rapture. This is important because it's contrary to popular belief. Everyone thinks that Gentiles get a second chance after the rapture. There's even been a Hollywood movie that mocks the concept because everybody missed the rapture because they were doing sinful things, and then all they had to do was like some good deed and they went to heaven. They were just mocking the Bible. But that's what people believe. Even preachers preach that everyone gets a second chance, but they don't. If you asked people, where in the Bible does that concept come from? 90% of people probably couldn't tell you. It actually comes from Revelation 24-6, but they're misusing that verse because it talks about the souls of those who are beheaded for not taking the mark of the beast and come back to life in Revelation 24-6. That's actually talking about the same 144,000 who are martyred in Revelation 14 and 15 for not taking the mark of the beast. So, it's the same ones. It's fairly obvious because it doesn't say exactly how they're martyred in Revelation 14, but the beast and the Antichrist are going to be Muslim, and that's what they use. They behead people. So, all the Israelites, for not taking the mark of the beast, they'll be beheaded, and then they come back to life in Revelation 20, but it's the same ones who were sealed in Revelation 7, because they're chosen by God, the most devout of the Jews. And then the same ones in Revelation 20 become priests during the 1,000 years. Just common sense says that a Gentile who missed the rapture and got in on some technicality second chance wouldn't become a priest, but it makes perfect sense for the 144,000 Jews to become priests because, like in the Old Testament, the tribe of Levi was a whole tribe of priests for the other tribes. And so for the 1,000 years, the 144,000 Jews will serve as priests for everyone else. That makes perfect sense, but not for the Gentiles. Another thing that Revelation 11 says that the Gentiles will trample the holy city for 42 months, and that's during the two witnesses. This means that Gentiles will flock over to Jerusalem to see the two witnesses to find out how they can get a second chance and get to heaven because of the popular belief. But the two witnesses in Revelation 11 torment people on earth. People are glad when they're killed because they're tormented by the two witnesses. That doesn't sound like the two witnesses are giving everybody good news that they can still be saved. They're giving people bad news that they lost their chance because they only get one chance. And Daniel 11:34, after the rapture, because the rapture is in the abomination in verse 31, but verse 34 says the wise will fall by the sword, etc., etc., and many who are not sincere will join them. Well, the not sincere are the Gentiles. So some Gentiles may indeed be martyred along with the wise. But that doesn't mean they get the same reward as those wise and get to go to heaven because they're deemed as not sincere. That doesn't sound very good. So I'm just trying to say that people need to be prepared ahead of time because you're only going to get one chance. Don't count on there being a second chance. And while earth is experiencing the tribulation, those who are raptured attend the wedding supper of the Lamb, and afterward ride white horses and follow Jesus back to earth for Armageddon in 1,000 years. That's in Revelation 19. And Armageddon is also in Revelation 16, but that's an earthly view where he pounds the beast with 100-pound hailstones. But Revelation 19 is kind of a more heavenly view when Jesus rides back to earth riding his white horse. And those who are raptured will be riding white horses behind him. But the wedding supper of the Lamb is mentioned in 19. It's mentioned in the past tense. It says the bride has made herself ready. So if you're a Christian and you've never ridden a horse or you're not very good at it, don't worry that because during the wedding supper of the Lamb, not only will we be eating a lot of good food, but we'll also be getting our training for riding our white horses, and we'll be expert riders when we're at the end of the wedding supper of the Lamb and following Jesus back to earth. So I can't wait to ride my white horse. That sounds like a fantastic thing to do. Near the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be let loose one last time. He'll entice the whole world, Gog and Magog, to come against God's people, at which time they will be destroyed by fire. And that's described in Revelation 20. When they're destroyed by fire, it distinctly says Gog and Magog. So that's got to be the same Gog and Magog that battles them in Ezekiel 38. That's just common sense that they have to be the same. There's no real time frame mentioned in Ezekiel 38, which in Revelation 20 it says distinctly that it's after the 1,000 years. So, just common sense says that the other one is after the 1,000 years, because they have to match. And then once everything is destroyed by fire, God creates a new heaven and new earth, at which time he will dwell with man, which was his intention all along. People ask me, well, why didn't he destroy Satan in the beginning if he knew Satan was going to foil his creation? Well, even if he knew Satan was thinking about it, God doesn't condemn people for what they think. He condemns them for their actions and their words. So he had to wait until Satan actually did something to condemn him. But then sin was already in the world. So God had to devise a new plan so that he could have that creation of humans, a whole group of humans who loved him and were without sin, that he could dwell with, because God can't dwell with sin. He's too perfect, holy. So he had to have a way where humans could erase their sins, and that's where Jesus came in. And so that's the only way that you can get your sins forgiven, is through Jesus. Jesus is the only way to the Father. That's because the Father is too holy to live with sin. So, but God created this whole 7,000-year plan to kind of mimic his 7-day plan, which he had initially had to do to dwell with man. So it didn't matter if it took 7,000 years instead of 7 days. God has all the time in the world. So it really doesn't matter to God that it took 7,000 years. He ended up with the same thing that he intended in the beginning. And Satan will be cast into the fire. So the final words, what is my purpose, in explaining end times like this? But it was never my intention to start an argument with other Christians. Pre-tribs and post-tribs were already doing that. I just wanted the truth. And I originally thought that all Christians would be glad to have a version of end times with no contradictions. Then Christians could unite against atheists, who are the real target, to convince them that the Bible is real. I thought that giving people a version of end times that made sense with no contradictions would convince non-Christians to be saved, because that's the real goal. But in regards to end times, many Christians are just set in their ways, especially post-tribs, who never listen and continue to twist Revelation, which is forbidden. Even when I explain a concept that has no contradictions, they still want to twist Revelation. It's just, I have no idea why they do that, but I know from emails that's what they do, from the ones I come in contact with. So this video is for open-minded people who want to know the truth with no contradictions. Of course, not everyone is interested in times, but everyone should be waiting for Jesus to return. That's what Christians should be doing. The number one thing a Christian should be wanting is for Jesus to return so we can go to heaven. And still, not everyone is interested, but they should be. But anyway, you can find more information about all these subjects. You can find the other videos that I mentioned at daniel11truth.com. And praise Jesus.